Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Laura, and I'm here tonight with Odessa, and we are very grateful to see all of you here. It is pretty incredible that everyone in this room is willingly choosing to spend their Thursday evening at a talk titled Climate Change, Heading for Extinction, and What to Do About It. So, thank you for being here. We are going to be covering some difficult subject matter tonight, talking about existential questions about the future of our planet. Part one, we'll start out with the scariest stuff, looking at the latest climate science, the future of biodiversity and of our species, and then part two, we'll get more cautiously positive with what we can do about that. So we encourage you to stay for the full presentation. We don't want you to leave partway through and go home feeling completely miserable. And on that note, I just want to add, if there are any children here tonight, or if you yourself feel like you may not be in the best place right now to contemplate existential questions and confront the reality of an unknown future, or if you simply can't commit to the full hour and a half, please seriously consider if you or your children would like to stay. We will be running these talks regularly, so if you choose to leave tonight, you're always welcome to join us another time. And before I go any further, I would just like to acknowledge the land that we're on. So these are the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And this acknowledgement has a particularly profound resonance this evening, as we're talking about the very future of our natural world, of which the First Nations peoples were for many thousands of years and continue to be deeply conscientious and resilient stewards to whom the majority of us here tonight, who are relatively recent settlers, owe our gratitude and support in the fight to protect these lands. As settlers, you have a right to be here because you're here, but we also have a deep responsibility being guests here. In general, I think this is the era where we learn that the inalienable counterpart to civil rights is civil responsibilities. So I extend, on behalf of myself and those settlers present in the room tonight, my tremendous gratitude for being able to share in the beauty and bounty of this beautiful corner of the earth that we call home. So this is a summary of what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'll be starting with part one, and that's just going to be a clear and simple roundup of the latest climate science. Whether or not you've heard this information before, there is real value in going over the whole picture just to ground ourselves in the seriousness of the situation that we're facing.
So I'll be giving the second half of the talk, which is demonstrating how our political systems are completely failing to take adequate action for the severity of the situation, explaining the social science of what actually enables change to happen in the world, and why we think that non-violent direct action is the appropriate response to the crisis that we're facing. And then I'll finally tell you about how you can actually get involved.
So this talk originated with Dr. Gail Bradbrook of Extinction Rebellion, who has a PhD in molecular biophysics, and you can see her own version of the talk online. We, as members of Extinction Rebellion Vancouver, have modified and adapted the talk for our own context. So Gail was a member of one of the founding members of Rising Up, which is the group that Extinction Rebellion emerged out of in the UK. And Rising Up was a network formed in 2016 as a group of scientists, activists, and organizers from various backgrounds, Earth First, Compassionate Revolution, Occupy, and they came together around promoting a fundamental change of our political and economic systems to ones that maximized well-being and minimized harm. So Extinction Rebellion emerged out of this group and issued a declaration of rebellion in October of 2018, and since then has grown to having affiliates in over 50 countries around the world now. It got kicked off in Canada in November 2018 with 2 women in a phone call with an international solidarity network. And from there, it spread to towns and cities across the country, from Nova Scotia to Vancouver Island, where people are beginning to mobilize. So now I would like to allow George Monbiot, who is a well-known figure in British environmentalism and politics, to introduce this talk tonight and share with you why he feels that the climate crisis is the most significant issue of our time.
Now, Brexit does not keep me awake at night. The political meltdown taking place in Britain does not keep me awake at night. Theresa May does not keep me awake at night, though she does often feature in my nightmares. The reason these issues, huge as they are, do not keep me awake at night is that I'm already sodding awake, because I'm fretting about things 1,000 times bigger. We are being faced simultaneously with a series of humongous existential crises. Climate breakdown, ecological cascading collapse, the disappearance of insects. Who knew they were important? The cascading collapse of marine ecosystems as well as terrestrial ones, driven primarily, it has to be said, by the food industry. Farming and fishing, the two most destructive industries on Earth. We give them a free pass on the basis that you can't criticize any industry that features in a children's book. We are faced with the disappearance of soil. We're faced with the contamination and disappearance in many parts of the world of fresh water. Just 2 days ago, we learned that air pollution is causing twice as much damage to our health as we previously thought. And before that point, we already knew that worldwide it was 3 times more deadly than AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. And yet what we see from our political and economic class is a mixture of indifference and denial, occasionally grading into despair. Now, people of my generation, and I spent years grappling with this, denied and denied and denied, either that there was a problem at all or that the problem was as important as we know it is. And then suddenly, a few years ago, what they were saying changed. Suddenly, instead of saying it's not an issue or it's not important, they said, okay, we accept it's an issue and it's important, but sadly, it's now too late to do anything about it. Between the denial and the despair, there was not one moment at which they said, it's real, it's an issue, and therefore we must act. And faced with this indifference, this despair, this denial, I began to fall into something resembling a state of despair myself. I thought people aren't going to see it. They refuse to see it. They don't want to know. And we tried to get mobilizations going, and we had small ones which flared up and then disappeared again like fireworks. We went up and we came down the same way. And I began to think, nothing is going to take this on. Nothing is going to tackle this. And then suddenly, 2 extraordinary movements emerge just at the moment I thought that hope had died. Extinction Rebellion and the climate strikes. And we honor and applaud all those magnificent people who have led these 2 converging and essential movements. Thank you to all of them. They give me hope where hope seemed absent. They give me determination where determination was flagging. And they give me belief that for the first time in years, a belief that we really can meet these issues head on and turn around our catastrophic political and economic systems so that they serve us rather than destroy us.
Okay, so having heard that, we'd like to share with you why we're here tonight, why we care about this issue. Neither Odessa nor I are experts in climate science. This isn't going to be a talk about detailing the latest modeling or talking about cutting-edge solutions to climate change. This is a talk that's going to be amplifying the voices of the much more qualified people who have been doing that work for a long time, and also framing it in the context of all of us. That being said, I do have a bit of a background with this material. I just graduated from UBC. My degree was in biology and philosophy, and for a lot of that, my emphasis was in oceanography. So I spent quite a bit of time with climate science and climate modeling. But the main reason why I'm here is that I just graduated a few months ago, and a big question that's been on my mind for the last while has been what work matters for this moment. And as I try to decide on next steps to take, I'm looking out at a future that is accelerating in how much it's changing, that is increasingly unpredictable, that's nothing like the world my parents grew up in. And all the benchmarks I've learned my whole life for how to make good choices and how to pick a good path forward just don't apply in the same way anymore. So how do you begin to navigate that? And for me, a first step is advocating for the science that I've learned that starts to describe that volatile reality that's coming at all of us very fast to scramble all of our choices. So that's why I'm here tonight.
And I'm here tonight for a lot of reasons, a lot of really good reasons. I feel really bad about the fact that we're taking, hundreds of thousands of other species down with us. But there is actually a more personal and perhaps self-motivated reason for being here for me. I'm 31 years old. I've always wanted to have children. And I'm in a position now where I can actually start thinking about that. And I did start seriously thinking about it in the last year. And because of who I am, I thought of all the pros and cons and what is that really gonna look like, and do I have the money, and blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly another light went off in my brain about something that I've also known about since I was a little kid, and that's that we are headed into a very uncertain future, and I was seeing more and more of that around me. I could feel it happening when I went outside. And that made me think that I could not, where I am now, in good conscience, bring another person into the world with that uncertainty for the future. So I saw movements like the school strikes and like Extinction Rebellion and like George Monbiot. They gave me hope. So I'm here tonight because this activity gives me hope, and I am banking on us to succeed before my biological clock runs out.
And now we'd like to hear a bit from you. So if everyone could just turn to the person next to them and exchange a few words about what brought you here tonight and what you're hoping to get out of this evening, and then we'll bring it back in a moment. Thank you. I would just like to recognize the courage that it takes to share your feelings about this issue with another person, possibly someone you just met. So hopefully this feels to you like a space where it's safe to do that and like you're in good company tonight. Okay, so the way that we normally talk about climate change, and the way that I've been trained to talk about climate change for years now, is to be optimistic and focus on the positive stories. And that can be a very powerful thing, but it also runs a great risk that we never sit down and fully face the reality that we're in. So we're not going to do that tonight. Tonight we're going to be guided by this core principle of Extinction Rebellion, that is, tell the truth and act as if the truth is real. So the premise of this talk is to tell the truth and ask us all to act accordingly and consistently with the information that's presented to us, including our understanding of what actually enables change to happen in the world. This is not an easy thing to do. You may find yourself feeling anger, despair, grief, and whatever it is that you're feeling, I encourage you to sit with those feelings. Firstly, because we don't often get an opportunity to do that, and also because I think it's a very important first step to sit down and actually feel the situation that we're in order to clearly see how we can move forward from there. So grief is welcome here. none of what we're about to share is easy to hear. So thank you for being here and being willing to face this. This isn't a grief workshop, but if you need to, feel free to shed tears or hang on to a friend. There will at least be an opportunity to pause for that part. And if you're having real difficulty, please come see us after, and we're happy to talk with you more about it. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the information that we have about climate change. What is the nature of that information? And in science, knowledge is built through review and consensus building. So you start with an individual scientist and their own work, and in order for that to be published, it's reviewed by other peers in their field, and once something's published, other scientists will draw on that for their work. Oftentimes you'll get meta-analyses of a lot of different papers in the field, so studies of studies, and that's peer-reviewed. You get up to something like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an international body composed of climate scientists from around the world that is tasked with reviewing thousands of papers every year and producing comprehensive summaries of all the science in a single field, so in this case, climate science. And at every step of that process, the science is intensively debated, critiqued, and pulled apart. So the conclusions that survive the process are very rigorous. However, these are also the conclusions that the most cautious and reticent members of a scientific community are prepared to stand behind. So as well as being very rigorous, they can also potentially be viewed as fairly conservative. So when we're talking about the IPCC, we're talking about mainstream, completely non-controversial science. You may or may not have seen the most recent IPCC report that came out last year in October. And basically, it was looking at the difference between 1.5 degrees of global temperature rise versus 2 degrees of global temperature rise. And what it found is that 1.5 degrees is really bad, and 2 degrees is much worse. The difference is extreme, and we need to keep things to 1.5 degrees. The problem is that 1.5 degrees is also not a safe level of warming. So we see disastrous consequences at that level. It will require massive global adjustments, result in massive global conflicts, and loss of life, human and otherwise. So to emphasize what this report means, I would just like to share with you some quotes from some of the scientists representing this mainstream, fairly conservative process. So this is Eric Solheim, Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. It's like a deafening smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. We have to put out the fire. And this is Dr. Deborah Roberts, co-chair of the IPCC Impacts Group. It's a line in the sand, and what it says to our species is that this is the moment, and we must act now. The next few years are probably the most important in our history. So what is the situation that we're also alarmed by? Where are we with climate change? This is showing you the total amount of warming experienced to date, and as you can see, it varies widely across the world. But what we are looking at is an average temperature increase of just over 1 degree Celsius. And it's worth noting that Canada, as we recently heard, is warming at twice that global rate, and our Canadian Arctic at 3 times that rate, just due to our geographic position. Already at this 1 degree of warming, we're seeing substantial detectable impacts, especially on vulnerable ecosystems like coral reefs. We're seeing impacts on the frequency of extreme events, on our ability to grow crops in many parts of the world, and even things like heat-related mortality. So unquestionably, climate change is already changing and ending lives around the world. This is at 1 degree of warming. So what does the future hold? This graph is based on data from the IPCC, and this black line here is showing you emissions to date. So I'm just going to walk you through 3 potential scenarios of what could happen next. The first one is indicated by the yellow and green sections at the bottom. Let's call that our magic wand scenario. So let's imagine that we just wave a magic wand and stop all emissions right now. Of course, warming wouldn't stop immediately, the same way that if you slam your brakes on your car doesn't stop right away. But this would take us to somewhere between 1.3 and 1.7 degrees of warming by the end of the century. But this is our magic wand scenario. It's not possible, and we know that. So let's imagine we don't do that, but instead that we keep all the promises we've made around the world to tackle climate change. including our promises under the Paris Agreement. And if we do that, indicated by these blue sections in the middle, we're headed for 3 degrees, around 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That's double the line in the sand that the IPCC have drawn for us, and that's our optimistic policies scenario. At that level of warming, we see 99% of coral reefs extinct. The Arctic sea ice is gone, Southern Europe is in permanent drought, and sea level rise is swallowing cities from Miami to Jakarta. In addition to these things, we see a high risk of abrupt, irreversible impacts of climate change. And finally, what happens if we carry on as we are, business as usual? What happens then? If we do that, indicated by this gray area up top, we're headed for more than 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century, actually, according to the IPCC, as much as 6. This is beyond catastrophic as a scenario. We really can't know or understand what a world like this would entail. And just to put in perspective our current emissions trajectory, emissions aren't steady or stagnant, and they're definitely not declining. Emissions are actually rising. So in 2018, global emissions hit a record high. We pumped more CO2 into the atmosphere than any single year before on record. And then this year, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere hit 415 parts per million. And that number is significant because that level in our atmosphere has not been seen in millions of years since before humans existed. So while our climate is always changing, and this has happened on Earth before, never in the course of our evolution. No human being has ever existed on a planet like this. And proportionally, Canadians are much more responsible for this than if you lived in an African, Asian, or European country. Canadians are only 0.5% of the global population, but per capita, we produce 4 times the average of global emitters, and that makes us the second highest per capita emissions of any G20 economy, only behind Saudi Arabia. But of course, these scenarios we've looked at, those are what we expect to see based on our emissions. But do we always see what we expect with the climate? So this graph is showing you the extent and thickness of sea ice in the Arctic. And for several years, we saw a period of steady decline, which was what we expected. But then in the late 2000s, this area of really the thickest multi-layer ice just dropped off to a fraction of what it was even a few years before. And this red line is showing you what that looked like in comparison to the blue area there, which is what we expected to see according to IPCC models. So as you can see, what we're actually observing drops significantly lower than even the worst range of IPCC projections. And relatedly, you may have heard this recently, this paper just came out, the permafrost in our Canadian Arctic, so ground that is supposed to stay frozen by definition for at least 2 years, is thawing at levels and depths not expected by IPCC models until 2090. So that's 70 years ahead of schedule, and that's happening right now. So the data and the models are way off, fundamental underestimations. And this has led, especially in recent years, for some scientists to break rank. So traditionally, academia has been quite conservative, but now you have Professor Hans Schellenhuber, who is head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He's senior advisor to the Pope, to German Chancellor Angela Merkel, to the European Union, so a credible voice. And what he's saying is that climate change is now reaching the end game. The issue is the very survival of our civilization. So What Lies Beneath the Understatement of Existential Climate Risk report came out last year, and it talks about how climate policymaking is embedded in a culture of failure and scientific reticence. And it argues for an urgent risk reframing of the research in IPCC reports, containing voices from some of the world's leading scientists. So why are we seeing things that we don't expect with climate change? That's a huge question, and we can't answer all of it now. But to start, I want to talk a bit about feedback loops and tipping points. So this is an example of a feedback loop, the albedo effect, and we're all really familiar with this one. It's why if you went outside in this week's heat in a black t-shirt, you got way hotter than if you went out in a white t-shirt. And in this case, what we're seeing is that as the sea ice melts, you replace this white reflective surface with a dark, very absorbent surface of water. So the water takes up more heat, and that causes more sea ice to melt, and so you enter this vicious loop, and this causes the entire process of sea ice melt to accelerate, to go faster. This is an example of a feedback loop that we understand really well, but there are loads of others that we don't have as solid an understanding of. So this example is the weakening of our natural sinks. And by natural sinks, I mean forests and other ecosystems that naturally draw down carbon and therefore are slowing down climate change, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And Canada's boreal forests actually account for 12% of the global land-based carbon reserves, but they haven't been a net sink since 2001. Climate change is weakening the ability of our natural sinks to do this, whether it's through drying out due to temperature rising, disappearance due to logging or increased wildfires, or whether it's from being attacked more and more by insects that thrive in the warmer, drier conditions that we're creating. So this picture on the left and in the bottom right there also, those are boreal forests right here in British Columbia. And all the red that you see in those pictures, those are trees that have been killed by a single species of beetle, the mountain pine beetle. In its worst year, this single outbreak caused more emissions than 40 years of wildfires in Canada. So you can imagine that with these processes that we don't have a great understanding of, that we have uncertainty about, it's hard to build them into our models predicting what the future will look like. So often, processes with uncertainties are either underrepresented or not represented at all, completely missing from our mainstream models for what the future will look like. And then in addition to processes we're uncertain about, we also have the complete unknowns, the total surprises that we're in for. So this is a paper that was published in Nature just earlier this year, and it's looking at quite an extreme scenario. It's looking at business as usual in terms of emissions for about another century. And at that point, CO2 would be so high in the atmosphere that it would cause cloud banks, so large expanses of cloud, to abruptly disperse. And what this would mean is up to an additional 8 degrees of warming, on top of the warming we would already expect to see at that point. And I'm not sharing this with you because I think we should all be really frightened about that 8 degrees. I don't think that. As I said, this is an extreme scenario, and I don't think it's likely to come to pass. But I'm sharing it with you as a reminder that as we create this increasingly unfamiliar world, we're going to be in for surprises. And as this scientist says, those surprises are probably not going to be pleasant. So we can't talk about unexpected things with climate change without talking about tipping points and abrupt climate change. So tipping points is this idea that climate change will reach a threshold beyond which impacts will run away from us. So picture a ball rolling down a hill that suddenly accelerates and you can't get it back. So in this case, we're not just talking about feedback loops, but domino cascades of feedback loops. And this was coined the hothouse Earth effect in a paper that was published with the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences recently. And they were looking at 10 of these feedback loops. So things like release of methane hydrates from the ocean floor, permafrost thaw, dieback of the Amazon rainforest, 10 of them. And what looking at those feedback loops revealed is that if the Earth warms to 2 degrees Celsius, it can tip from there into a hothouse state and stay there. Can't get it back. So, as many scientists have said, 2 degrees is not a good move. It has to be 1.5, and 1.5 was never a great move either. So this has led Johan Rockström, one of the authors of this paper, and also executive director of the Stockholm Resilience Center, to say 50 years ago, this would have been dismissed as alarmist, but now scientists are really worried. So what does all this mean in terms of the scenarios that we looked at before? As we talked about, feedback loops are causing all of these processes to accelerate. So the changes that we've experienced in our lives, the rate of change that we kind of know on our own is happening, is not representative of how fast things are going to be changing, because you have these things like feedback loops that are speeding it all up. So changes will not be linear. Right now we're sitting at just over 1 degree Celsius of warming above pre-industrial baselines, and there was a University of Washington paper that came out recently, was published in Nature. There were also UN warming estimates, and what they said is that the idea that we hold to 2 degrees Celsius within the lifetime of people born today is highly unlikely. In fact, we have a 1% chance of meeting our Paris targets. We have only a 5% chance that we can hold things to 2 degrees. The likely range is between 2.4 and almost 5 degrees Celsius with a median of 3.2 degrees. You have horrendous consequences at those temperature rises, and that's within my lifetime today. So what does this mean for the scenarios we were looking at? It means that while our predictions for the future are terrifying, they're also not based on a complete picture. And we can't treat these ranges of uncertainty as safety nets. We're already off the map in terms of the climate that we know. And as we go further and further into this gray area up here, we'll know less and less about what we're actually getting ourselves into. That being said, there are some things that we know we're getting ourselves into. One of them is sea level rise, which we've all heard a lot about, and it's going to affect hundreds of millions of people, actually up to 1 billion. Our lower mainland is in trouble, as are Ottawa and Montreal, Halifax. And this graphic at the top is showing you what the lower mainland will look like at 1.5 degrees of warming due to sea level rise. So Richmond is underwater. Parts of Surrey, Coquitlam, and the North Shore are underwater. This is at 1.5 degrees. We could hit this by 2030 if we keep going at our current pace. And we also have to remember that other parts of the world are going to be experiencing much more extreme impacts of this. This map is showing all the populations worldwide that are at risk of flooding, and the different colors aren't more or less risk. They're just bigger or smaller populations, so they're all at risk. Miami will be inundated. Shanghai will be decimated. There will be more people on the move in the 21st century than ever before. And the big question is, where are they going to go? So sea level rise isn't the only way that we'll lose lands to climate change. We'll also lose them to desertification as temperatures rise. And as rainfall becomes more variable and unpredictable, it will be harder to grow crops in many parts of the world. So this graph is showing you global hunger. It's from the Food and Agriculture Organization, branch of the UN. And as you can see, global hunger was declining for quite a while, and then around 2014, this trend reversed, and it's been on the rise ever since. And this report cites climate change and climate-related shocks as a key driver of that reversal. So migration and hunger, these are things that we only need to think about the last few years to imagine the social and political consequences of, and especially the enormous human cost. In particular, the voices that are most likely to be affected are those we're least likely to hear. And when we're talking about the victims of the climate crisis, we're not just talking about humans, we're of course talking about other species as well. So these plants and animals here are among those that are at risk of extinction right now in Canada and around the world. And the number of extinctions that we're observing is astronomically higher than what we should be expecting as a background rate. And what this tells us is that we're in the midst of the Earth's 6th mass extinction. Scientists are calling it biological annihilation. There have been 5 previous mass extinctions in the geological record of the Earth. Most of us have heard the most about the last one with the dinosaur and the asteroid. But there were 4 more before that, and all of them were caused by rapid rises in atmospheric CO2. So the WWF Living Planet report came out in 2017, and it showed that since the 1970s, we have wiped out 60% of animal populations. That is a very difficult number to comprehend. So for context, if we did that with humans, it would mean wiping out North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Oceania, and China. And then the UN released this landmark report earlier this year that warned us that 1 million species could be pushed to extinction within the next few years. So the tremendous variety of living species that make up our life-supporting safety net, that give us clean air, food, energy, water, are under serious existential threat. BC has 1,807 species at risk of extinction. That's more than any other province or territory in Canada. And in an extinction crisis, it's the apex predators that are the most vulnerable because they lose the things that they depend upon to stay alive. The essential interconnected web of life on Earth is getting smaller, and when scientists become poets, biological annihilation, you know you're in trouble.
Sorry.
So let's get to this question that I really posed with the title of this talk. Could the climate crisis and ecological breakdown be enough to wipe out humanity? And I think it's really important to think about the significance of what we're asking with that question. At the start of the talk, I told you that climate change is already changing and ending lives around the world right now at 1 degree of warming. We know that we're headed for overshoot scenarios that will almost certainly come with unprecedented levels of human suffering. So given that, should it really take the threat of complete human extinction to motivate us to act? Or do we feel confident in the notion that somewhere, somehow, some people will survive, and that's enough? Despite that, let's take this as a theoretical question. So could it be possible? And to do that, I'm just going to draw your attention to one paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2017 that looked at this question. It looked at low probability, high impact climate change scenarios, including those where climate change is an existential threat. So those are scenarios with a probability of happening of 5%. And I'm just going to read you a quote from one of the authors of that paper to put that number into context. When we say 5% probability high impact event, people may dismiss it as small, but it is equivalent to a 1 in 20 chance the plane you're about to board will crash. We would never get on that plane with a 1 in 20 chance of it coming down, but we're willing to send our children and our grandchildren on that plane. Whether or not this ends in extinction, I think we need to take a hard look at the kind of world that we're headed for. All of these conditions, mass migration, crop failures, ongoing natural disasters, are the perfect breeding ground for fascism. And as Adorno said, fear and destructiveness are the major sources of fascism. World War II teaches us in recent memory what humans are capable of doing to each other under extreme circumstances, and the ecological crisis goes off the charts in terms of extreme circumstances. We only need to look at the history books to know how society breaks down when people are faced with hunger and when their children's lives are at stake. 1 million climate refugees are already destabilizing European politics. Around the world, right-wing authoritarian governments, like in Bolsonaro's Brazil, are rising to power on the backs of people's desperate discontent with legacies of poverty and inequality, promising them simple measures to protect them and appease their desires for security. The longer that liberal elites remain ineffective, refusing to meaningfully address the root causes of societal disintegration, the more these demagogues and charlatans are emboldened and empowered. It's really important that we situate the climate crisis within the global ascent of fascism, because from here on out, circumstances will bolster the forces of reaction. The window that we have to address this in a cooperative, mutually beneficial way is rapidly shrinking. And if we wait until we feel the effects of this in our own lives, that window will be long gone. So this has been a lot. And at this point, I'd just like us all to take a moment of complete silence to process what we just heard. Breathe, close your eyes, squeeze a hand, get some water, and we'll bring things back in a few moments.
Thank you. takes a lot of courage to face this grief. It also requires a huge shift in consciousness from the narcissistic consumerist culture that we're all used to living in of, what about me? What do I have to do to make my life better? How do I hang on to privilege for me and my family? It asks us to accept that this is a time for grieving and that we still can appreciate beauty. We have to keep ourselves in good shape for the tasks that are required of us. This grief asks us to step into service and be willing to do the things that just might make a difference. So, let's bring ourselves home to Canada. I think we can agree from the previous half of this presentation that we are headed for an unprecedented emergency. But our elected officials are taking measures that are actively making it worse, like subsidizing big oil with $3.3 billion a year, or investing in natural gas, or buying pipelines. This is nothing new. Canada has a long history of astonishingly low-ball climate policy, of setting grossly inadequate goals that it is then not even able to meet. We showed this in our own 2018 audit, in which it was revealed we missed the 1992 Rio emissions target. We missed the 2005 Kyoto targets and then ran away from them in 2011 and just dropped them. We're on track to miss the 2020 Copenhagen targets. We're nowhere in the ballpark of our 2030 Paris Agreement targets. But, hey, we are on track to meet our 2050 targets by the year 2961. Almost a millennium late. So Canada's a screaming example of what Nobel Prize-winning economist calls, his name is William Nordhaus, calls the free rider problem. This is when politicians fluff up positive rhetoric around climate change without actually having to show anything for it. So I think it's obvious. When it comes to the climate crisis, Canada has its head fully buried in the oil sands. Right?
Yes.
Okay, so now we're back home. And I want you to take a moment to yourselves to reflect on the impacts of climate change in your life already. So maybe that's the rising insurance costs that come along with the increase in extreme weather events. Maybe that's waking up to that orange sun, that blot in the sky last summer when the air quality here in Vancouver was worse than in Beijing because of the wildfires being so bad. Or maybe you couldn't bear to look at the news last year when one of our resident southern orca whales carried the dead body of her child, likely dead of malnutrition, for 17 days in an unprecedented display of grief from one of our own mammalian cousins. And this is a key point about climate change. It's not just about numbers on a screen. It's about the human cost and the cost to all living things that climate change and the human activity that is continuing to make it worse are having. We are all in this together. We all have, or soon will have, a story about how climate change is impacting our lives. And if we don't change direction soon, those stories are going to get a lot worse. So I'm going to center one of those stories now. This is Caleb Bain. He's Echo Dene and Duneza Cree from Treaty 8 in northwestern British Columbia, the center of BC's fracking operations. Fracking is a cute way of saying hydraulic fracturing, and it's how industry and government get at natural gas. They like to tout it as a clean energy alternative, but we know that it increases methane levels, methane having a global warming impact at least 21 times greater than carbon. Despite this, last year, the NDP, with Trudeau's Liberals, approved a $40 billion LNG pipeline through northern BC. It's Caleb who knows the true costs of this decision.
It looks like flaring in the night sky all over your territory. It looks like big trucks with big burly men A highly profitable boom and bust type economy has intrinsic difficulties, especially when sitting on top of 100 years of not so healthy cultural interactions, alcoholism, sexual abuse, physical abuse, endemic violence, both in the community around us and within our own family.
Children have a predisposition for amplified suffering as a result of exposure to toxins.
As you know from my face, growing up was surgeries, going under the knife, waking up all bruised and bloody and ugly and confused.
I think I'm one of the few people in Canada who can say I've had my lips sewn together.
So, even though the most authoritative study on fracking's health effects found that, quote, there is no way that fracking can be practiced in a manner that does not threaten human health, the NDP's own scientific study, eventually meant to justify its LNG project, just left human health aspects completely out. So in response to that scientific study, when it came out, Caleb pointed out the fact that this isn't about the risk of someone being blown up on an oil rig, okay? It's about the long latency cumulative effects. So it's about gestational problems like birth defects, which he himself suffers from. It's about cancer and asthma. He went on to say, quote, the government have shown themselves ready to sacrifice us and the unborn who will come after us in this territory. So Canada's Indigenous people have known for a long time what it feels like when the government doesn't care that much about your well-being. And now, with climate change, we're all starting to find out what that feels like. And this is what's really worrying about climate change and the human activity like natural resource exploitation and consumerism that are making it worse, is that they are stressors on every form of inequality that we have. As the world gets warmer, the stressors are going to fall unevenly on those who are already the most oppressed. This is true not only internationally. Poorer countries, especially in the global south, are going to be worse off, but it is also true within richer countries. As with any crisis, marginal populations are going to suffer more. That's children. That's people with chronic health problems, people with inadequate housing, people who already suffer from food insecurity. So climate change is really the social justice issue of our time. It is the issue that connects every other issue that we're facing. And until we realize that, we cannot get serious about action. We are going to see the human cost of climate change in our hospitals and moratoriums. Insect-borne diseases are on the rise. Lyme disease more than doubled in Canada between 2016 and 2017. We are seeing more deaths by extreme heat, especially in Quebec and Ontario. We're seeing more respiratory conditions, and we're getting a strain on our medical system due to shock weather events. In 2018, a record-breaking year for air quality advisories in Vancouver, the authorities reported a 120% increase in daily physician visits and an 80% increase in asthma prescriptions dispensed. Earlier this year, in February, our country's public health officials issued this alarming call on the federal government to act. Federal parties must recognize that climate change is the greatest public health challenge of the 21st century and make climate solutions a priority in the 2019 federal election. But our government already knows this is real. They say so in their own reports. Earlier this year, a report from Environment and Climate Change Canada, the first in a series called Canada in a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action, came out. And you can see in the headline statements that they know that Canada is warming at twice the global rate, they know that it's due to human activity, and they know that it's going to get worse. So my question is to our government, how exactly is any of this knowledge being advanced for action? How are you acting in any way as if this is real? We got our answer earlier this year. Our Prime Minister declared a climate emergency on June 17th. a non-binding PR stunt meant to blunt the next day's blow, approving a $5.5 billion Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. And by the way, I saw an article recently, $5.5 billion is basically just what it costs to buy it. It's gonna cost more than $15 billion by the end of it, assuming it happens, which it won't. So, that just about sums up the state of climate inaction and ecocidal hypocrisy in Canada. This is what policy researcher Seth Klein calls the new climate denialism, and this is much more insidious than the old, well, climate change doesn't exist, human-caused climate change doesn't exist. That's it. This is when the government says, yes, we accept the science, we know climate change is real, but we can be serious about that and still increase fossil fuel extraction. We don't have to make hard decisions, right? That's not true. That is just not true. This is a study that came out on Canada Day of this year in the journal Nature. As you've heard from previous slides, one of the most prestigious and well peer-reviewed scientific journals out there. They discovered that globally, existing fossil fuel infrastructure already commits us to overshooting the IPCC targets of 1.5 degrees of warming. If we include all in-progress and planned infrastructure, that jumps to 190 billion tons higher. And guess where 1/3 of that development is set to happen? That's right. Good job. So to be clear, a climate plan that is anything less than canceling all planned or in-progress fossil fuel infrastructure is a non-starter because it will have absolutely no chance of meeting that 1.5 degree target. So we have to face the reality there has been a tremendous lack of concrete action. The graph on the left shows the increase in greenhouse gases globally. In 1990, when the first IPCC report was released, so that's 29 years ago, almost my whole life, the UN warned us to keep to 1 degree Celsius of warming or face societal collapse. CO2 emissions are 60% higher today and rising, methane even more so. And we've already talked about tipping points, so we know that at some point, and maybe we've already reached it, we won't be able to go back. So we have to conclude, our political processes have failed to deliver for people or the planet. Our governments have failed to introduce the large-scale changes that are only in their power to implement. Canada has shown it in their own audits that we are not achieving our targets, and yet we are free to turn around and buy pipelines? So, what's an appropriate response when the normal channels are not working? Yeah. We believe that we need to rebel. Now, the rhetoric around rebellions is very much associated with the left and with revolutions, etc. But let's be clear. Our stance is that climate change is a threat to the values of all, no matter what your political affiliation or belief. And in this scenario, rebellion is the proper response regardless of your political party. Climate change is not and should not be a political issue. So just to make my point, here's two old white men. You might have heard of them. They've been rather foundational in the formation of Western thought. And I'm bringing them up here because they represent the bedrock of left and right values. Climate change is a threat to the individual and property rights that liberals hold so dear. Homes and property will be destroyed, and the rights of our children are certainly not guaranteed. John Locke had something called the right to revolution. When a government fails to protect the lives and livelihood of its citizens, the people have a right to rebel. Then we have Hobbes. Now, the conservative perspective on climate change is rarely talked about, and that's kind of strange, because climate change is diametrically opposed to the conservative ideal of maintaining the status quo. Climate change is also a threat multiplier. So war, terrorism, all those threats to national security and order, they become much worse. And these represent the bedrock of conservative thought, the cornerstones. So Hobbes said that the state derives its authority from its willingness and ability to maintain order and security, and that the obligation of subjects to the sovereign is to last as long and no longer as the power lasteth by which he is able to protect them. So across the political spectrum, theorists agree that rebellion is justified when the establishment fails. The government now has rendered the bonds of the social contract null and void by its continuing failure to provide for the well-being of its people and the future of the planet. Okay, so what are we rebelling for? This is not just about random uprisings in the streets with no plan. Definitely not. Extinction Rebellion has 3 demands. First, government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency, working with other institutions to communicate the urgency for change. So governments conduct public health campaigns based on science all the time. Don't drink and drive, wear a seatbelt, smoking kills, and essentially we're asking for the same thing. We're saying, tell the truth, give your citizens accurate information to solicit mass behavior change, and also so that we understand where we're going and what policies need to be put in place. This will need to be an effort between the government, the media, and our educational institutions. 2, the government must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. This is a big ask. It's very ambitious. So the IPCC says 2050. But as we know, that leaves out a ton of known unknowns and a ton of way more terrifying unknown unknowns. Plus my biological clock will be up by then, so. 60% of the modules for the next IPCC report due out in 2021 are already out. And they're shocking scientists because they're showing that things could be going twice as fast as they had expected. So we don't have time. As I said, net carbon neutral in 6 years, it's a big ask. So how do we think we could get there? Well, one of the ways we think we could get there is a mobilization like what happened in the Second World War. During World War II, countries transformed their economies within a matter of months to deal with an existential threat. Factories that were producing cars within weeks were producing something for the war effort. Canada created 28 crown corporations, and we were pumping out 300 airplanes a week. So we have the historical precedent. We know that it's possible. What we need now is the social and political will. Now, you might find this precedent somewhat problematic, and let me be clear, I'm not a fan of war. But this idea of everybody pulling together with a common goal, with a common experience, it's really powerful, and there is something to be learned from this time. But there was a big problem, and that was that there was a huge democratic deficit. People were not being asked. Things were just being pushed through, and we don't want that. We do not want eco-fascism. So that brings me to our 3rd demand. The government must create and be led by the decisions of a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. So a citizens' assembly is a decision-making body of about 100 randomly selected people, kind of like jury duty for climate. They would be presented the facts by experts who would divulge their funding. They would go through a rigorous decision-making process that would be professionally facilitated. They would therefore be representative. They would understand the facts about climate change, and they would make decisions in a thoughtful and fair manner. When used, citizens' assemblies have actually come up with really, really good policies. This random selection of citizens to fill political posts in assemblies is called sortition. And the greater XR community is working with the Sortition Foundation, who are experts on this. Some of the advantages are that it gets rid of It gets rid of party politics and short-term electoral thinking. And it gets us away from the lobbying and corruption and power that our carbon-heavy industries have over our elected representatives and our system. They've already been used successfully in Ireland, setting up the terms for the referendums on abortion and gay marriage. Those were considered fair and they worked well. They were also used to decide about nuclear waste handling in Australia. Incidentally, they also get us back to the way democracy was originally intended to be practiced by the ancient Greeks. If you were a man with property, but that would be the case. So, these are our demands, and this is what we are rebelling for. How do we think we can get people to do this? Let me remind you of the premise of this talk, which is to tell the truth and ask us all to act accordingly and consistently with the information that's presented to us, including our understanding of what actually enables change to happen in the world. In other words, tell the truth and act as if the truth is real. This represents a big shift in the discourse around climate change as it has been communicated in the last 15 years or so. So this has been the thing. With traditional environmental NGOs and the media, they've known that climate change is a really bad thing, but you can't terrify people, because if you terrify people, they'll just get overwhelmed, they won't act at all, that'll be counterproductive. And that might be a good point if you're trying to motivate everybody. But what if you're not trying to motivate every single person? So this is a rough illustrative graph. It's just a standard bell curve. It's not real data. Just to illustrate a point. Showing how people respond to knowing about climate change. So over here we have people who really don't care. They're just blah, blah, blah. I don't care. They're not going to do anything. They're not going to change. Carrying on. On the other hand, we have committed, active environmentalists who know about the science, they understand it, and they are actively changing their behavior. In the middle, we have the majority of people who think it's a good idea to look after the environment, but who aren't really changing their behavior all that much. So the assumption is that if you tell them the truth and scare them, this will happen. They'll be like, oh my God, this is too much. Can't handle this. And they'll be scared and they'll run away and they'll go distract themselves with Game of Thrones or knitting or alcohol or whatever it is that they like. But what about if that is not the reaction for everybody? What about when you tell the truth, this happens? A small bunch of people go, oh my God, this is the most important thing anyone has ever told me. We're headed for 4 or more degrees of warming, and we have got to do something about it. These are upstanders. For whatever reason, they act differently. Maybe it's something that's happened in their lives. Maybe it's their religious belief or their values, their mindset. And it makes them stand up and say, I'm going to act. I am willing to rebel on behalf of the greater good based on science. So that's a nice theory, but where's the evidence? The evidence is right here in this room. The evidence is in the uprisings around the world of people faced with this same information who are now in the streets with XR and the school strikes for future. It's true that upstanders will stand up. And here's another thing about telling the truth. So fear is a useful human emotion. It keeps us safe. It is very rational to be afraid of what you just heard. But it doesn't have to be paralyzing. We have at least 3 responses in the brain to fear, as you've probably heard: fight, flight, or freeze. So fight and flight are both actions. So fear-based campaigns, they do fail, and they fail when you don't tell people what they can do. You have to give people a sense of personal agency. One last thing about telling the truth and acting as if it's real. So conventional campaigning, sending emails, signing petitions, going on marches, it's not working. And great people, inspirational people, have dedicated years of their lives to this, but we have to be honest, it has failed to bring about the necessary changes. It is no longer an appropriate response to a potentially existential issue. There's something to be said for a response that is commensurate to the scale of the problem, right? So if you give someone a leaflet that says, climate change is really bad and it might cause human extinction, but all you've done is given them a leaflet, that's confusing, right? Because surely it can't be that bad, because if it were, people would be out in the streets. And that kind of messaging contributes to people thinking that what you're telling them isn't true. But this is the level of action that we've gotten to. We're acting as if we can personally recycle ourselves out of this problem or buy enough bamboo toothbrushes to save the world. And this focus on the individual, go vegan, drive an electric car, ride your bike, it ignores that there are powerful systems in place that are generating this crisis, that there are powerful forces that are actively trying to stop change from happening. You cannot overcome entrenched power with emails and petitions. We need a new approach. So I've told you the demands, and I've told you I think we can get a percentage of people to act. So what do we mean by rebellion? This is what we mean. Strategic Nonviolent Direct Action, or NVDA. This is a major system of resistance based upon the assumption that hierarchical systems can be modified or destroyed by a withdrawal of submission, cooperation, and obedience. There are 4 key principles to NVDA, especially XRs. First, it must be respectful. So nonviolence doesn't just mean that you do not punch people in the face, okay? There's actually a word in Sanskrit, ahimsa, which we translate to mean nonviolence, but it more accurately means a state of such open-heartedness that there's no room for hatred. And on a more practical note, when you're respectful, people are more likely to listen to you and they're more likely to agree with you. Secondly, it's disruptive. We know that with all structural political change, disruption works. Without disruption, there's no economic cost, and without an economic cost, the guys running the world really don't care. That's why labor strikes are so effective against companies, and that's why shutting down a capital city is so effective against governments. You have to hit them where it hurts, in their pockets. Now, XR's disruption, before you get worried, is low-level entry. It's about taking your body and your mind and putting it somewhere. It's not about special expertise or scaling buildings or going to remote, faraway places. It is economic disruption en masse, mainly in capital cities. Thirdly, it is sacrificial. Now, it doesn't have to be for everybody, but this does help. When people see you making a personal sacrifice, when people see you getting arrested or going on strike, you get their sympathy and you show that you're serious. So we remember the force feeding of the suffragettes, and we remember the poverty of striking miners who stuck with it day in and day out. That stuff really sticks. Fourth, it creates a backfiring response. So this is when you create a dilemma for the authorities. They can't keep letting you party in the streets, so eventually they have to resort to repression, to mass arrests, or to violence. But when they do that, millions of people following the disruption on TV, on social media, they see it, and it only takes 1% of those people to go, this is terrible. I'm gonna go down there and support those people. And it's checkmate for the authorities. The more people you take off the street, the more come onto them, and the party goes on. So, that's what we mean by rebelling. But will it work? This is Erica Chenoweth. She's professor of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, and she has studied a lot of civil disobedience. In fact, she studied 300 uprisings that took place since 1900, both violent and nonviolent. And she found that nonviolent action was twice as likely to succeed as violent action. And more importantly, she found that you don't need 100% of the population. You don't even need 75% or 50% or even 10%. The upper figure that she found was 3.5%. And in that case, it was always successful. So you need 3.5% of the population to rebel to create system change. This is a classic example. This was a successful movement using the principles I just outlined, and they succeeded with far less than 3.5% of the population. So up until the mid-1950s, the American civil rights movement was using all the usual channels without much success. And then from the mid-1950s onwards, they switched tack and they started using strategic nonviolent direct action, with thousands arrested and hundreds going to prison. One example of those campaigns is the Freedom Riders. So, as you may know, in the southern segregated states, black and white people could not sit in the same place on buses or trains. The Freedom Riders deliberately sat where they were not supposed to sit. This movement started with 13 people, and it ended with 4,400, with hundreds going to prison. That policy on the buses and trains changed within a year, so it happened really fast. Nonviolent civil disobedience has a robust history all through the 20th century, Gandhi, Mandela, up to the present day. It also has a robust history right here in BC. So for years, the BC labor movement of the 1980s was one of the most combative in the land. They rarely let a company's drive to increase profits without, at the workers' expense, go unchallenged. One example is the CR strike of 1980, when 10,000 clerical and regulatory workers walked off the job 9 days before they were in a legal strike position. Mostly young women, this is the biggest bargaining unit work stoppage in Canadian history. They pressured the Canadian government to reach a deal, getting 25% raise increase over 2 years, substantial gains for family care and maternity leave. And some of you may remember the 1993 Clayoquot Sound protests that took place on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So, in response to the BC government's giving permission to log 74% of the ancient forests in this area, protests broke out. For 3 months during the summer of 1993, over 12,000 people during that period came out to blockade Kennedy Bridge that led into the logging site. And every single day they got out there, they blockaded it, and then every single day they were given a police injunction to leave, and several people were arrested. They were successful in raising international awareness about the logging of temperate rainforests, and they also led to a number of policy changes that led to the protection of much of those forests, and you can still see them now. So Extinction Rebellion is doing just this. During the UK rebellion of April this year, 5,000 to 10,000 people occupied 5 key sites in central London over 11 days of protest in one of the biggest acts of peaceful civil disobedience in British history. There were over 1,000 arrests. Following the rebellion, the UK became the first country to issue a national declaration of climate emergency. And XR has now expanded, at the last count, to over 50 countries. I do want to say something about being arrested. So we're incredibly privileged to live somewhere where we can call a meeting of, 100 people and shout about rebellion without having someone show up at our door armed. Also, my experience of being arrested as a young white woman would be a fairly privileged one. It would be a lot different if I were a young Indigenous man or someone with English as a second language or someone non-straight passing. And using arrest as a core strategic tactic means being aware of the fact of the role that privilege plays and of somebody's position in life and in society and where they're at. And it means taking care of each other and adapting our expectations based on that understanding. So I've told you our strategy, our tactics, and our theory of change. This is our plan. We need all hands on deck. We also have a shared vision and set of values. These 10 points are the buy-in. You don't need permission to take action in the name of XR. You just have to agree to abide by these 10 principles. XR has brought together a huge number of people around the world behind a vision of radical system change, and these values are what it looks like. Here's a few examples of what Extinction Rebellion has done. At the top, there's a die-in at the Natural History Museum in London. The middle is the iconic Invisible Circus, and at the bottom, there's a funeral or a graveyard for extinct species. This is who we are. We believe that the system needs to change, and so do we all. So you might be sitting there thinking, wow, this is really great. But it's a bit too much. Maybe we should go through the proper channels a little longer. I mean, we have an election coming up. Maybe we just get some more Green MPs in Parliament. Maybe we get the Liberals or the Conservatives to prioritize this a little more. Maybe we do something on social media, or we go on a march. Just something a little smaller or neater. Or maybe this is the thing, but not for me, not for my family. We're headed for 4 degrees of warming, and the window is closing month by month. We can still change policies, and every fraction of a degree of warming that we prevent is going to make a difference in the lives of millions of people. But enough of us must act now. Here's another important point about climate change. It's not like a pipeline or a forest where if you stop it from happening or you save it, then it's done and it's saved for now. We can still change, but things are going to get really bad regardless, as you saw. So you can do something, but there's no win scenario here. And you have to sit with those 2 uncomfortable truths at the same time. Second, the fact that things are going to get really bad regardless. It leads you to examine your deepest motivations. Do you act only when you know you're going to win? Or do you act anyway? It leads you to examine your core values, who you are, why you do things. These are tough questions and they can be painful to answer. I told you at the beginning of this talk the reason that I was here. Because I do want to have children. And I do want to be able to look them in the eye and say, I did everything I could. This is Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, pledging to stand with the majority of BC's Indigenous people to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline from ever going through these lands, their lands, our stolen lands, whatever it takes. Finally, I'll leave you with this. This is Kate Marble. She's a top climate scientist, and this is her take on the whole motivation to act thing. As a climate scientist, I am often asked to talk about hope. Climate change is bleak, the organizers always say. Tell us a happy story, give us hope. The problem is, I don't have any. What we need is courage. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending.